Hello and welcome back. So the purpose of this fantasy draft strategy series is to help you maximize value at each of your draft positions and help you craft a team that can win championships. So the question that I wanted to get answered for today's presentation is, should you prioritize wingers or centers in your draft? And just a quick recap, the problem that you have is you have a limited number of roster spots and draft picks each year. If you're trying to build a championship team, how can you maximize the value you gain from each draft pick? And more importantly, how do you not waste value when you're drafting in the top like 6 rounds? Because if you swing and miss on a guy in that range, it's very difficult to make it up and try to regain control of your season. So the first rule of this strategy, and I went over this in a previous video in this series, is I strongly suggested that you don't draft a goalie in the top 30. Typically, the first round and the second round is not a place to pick a goalie, and if you want more clarity on that, you can visit the first video in this series. It's part of this playlist. The second rule, I also suggested that you draft 2 elite defensemen, one in the 20 to 30 range when the first D run starts to happen, and another power play quarterback offensive defenseman in the 40 to 80 range. And again, you can check that video out in this playlist. It's a part of this series. But what does this mean about your forward positions? Does any forward position provide more value relative to where you draft them? And specifically, which positions are more available later in drafts and on the waiver wire? So just a quick recap, offense matters. Now, there's not a ton of data on this that you can get from Yahoo that aggregates thousands of leagues and who wins and whatnot. So I had to go back to my own league, and I did a 4-year analysis going back in time to try to see if offense equals championships. And the short answer is yes. So there's 6 offensive categories in a standard Yahoo league, and typically this is the offensive category win percentage, how often you win those categories. Typically, if you are up here in the top of your league in offensive category win percentage, you win your league. And this is holding true every single year. Delaware River, he won here. Now, if you look here, this is 2021. I had an incredible 3 goaltenders. I had Shesterkin, Nedeljkovic, and Saros that season, and 2 of those 3 in the back half of the year were very good goaltenders. They were up for the Vezina potentially, and I ended up meeting him in the finals, but he had the better offense. I was down here in offense. I was 50%, he was 57%, and he ended up taking me in the championship game because of that. And if you go back even further, I had the better offense in 1920, and I won. And then in 1819, the best offense, he was number 1 in the regular season. He lost in the championship game because this year we had plus minus as well. And Moose had a big boost from plus minus on his team. But if you look at the opposite, the same is true. So River Cats, he was last in the league in offense, and he was 9th in the league total. So if you look at 1920, Ottawa Truckers down at the bottom of the league in offense, bottom of the league in general. 2021, bottom of the league, Zodiac Braves, second to last. And then last season, Wolfish was last in offense, and he finished last in general. So typically what that means is offense equals championships. You have to maximize your offensive value. And I went over some of that in the defensive video because I wanted to allow you guys to maximize your offensive value by adding 2 very prominent offensive defensemen to your forward group. But what about your forward group? So let's look at this dashboard that I created. This is just a 30,000 foot view of point per game players broken down by position. So this will just give you a quick glance as to what positions allow you to get a point per game. Now, scoring was up in the league last year. There were 44 players who hit a point per game average. Typically, you're looking at around 25 on average. But last year, scoring was up. I believe it was COVID related. There was something like 110 goaltenders played a game in the NHL last season. So obviously, scoring was up, and a lot of that went to the wingers. You see a lot of the usual suspects here: Kucherov, Rantanen, Forsberg, Kane. Same thing with the left wingers: Huberdeau, Panarin, Gaudreau, Kaprizov. But what you also see is guys like Zuccarello, Sam Reinhart, Jordan Kyrou, Lindholm, who's also center. This is data provided by Rotowire. So they only have 1 position, but a lot of these guys are dual position eligible. And you want to take a look at that when you're drafting because that's a big advantage if you can get dual position eligibility. But again, if you look over here, some of these guys you wouldn't necessarily have expected before the season to end up with over a point per game average. Buchnevich, Fiala, Robertson. But that's where a lot of this excess scoring last season went to. It went to the wingers and a couple defensemen as well. There's 3 point per game defensemen. Typically, there's only one or sometimes none in a given season. And these 3 averaged over a point per game. And then on top of that, you had guys like Fox and Ekblad who were just slightly under a point per game. And this holds true. 2021 is the same type of thing where there was an equal number of centers and left wingers that hit a point per game average. And I attribute that to COVID because things were a little bit different with the shortened season and all of the COVID protocols and guys missing time and everything else. So if you look at the last complete seasons that we have data for, this holds true a lot more. There's more centermen putting up a point per game average than wingers. And this is just, again, a 30,000 foot view just to give you a sense that there's a lot of centers that hit a point per game average. And this goes back 18-19, the same type of thing happening. There's a couple of wingers there that are hitting that number. Obviously, this data is old. Phil Kessel and Blake Wheeler, Radulov, no longer in the league. But, this just gives you a sense that there's typically every season, there's more centers that are hitting a point per game average than wingers. And this is a chart to show you the breakdown of how it works out. So there was 44 point per game players last year. A lot of that went to the wingers, as I said before. But still, no matter what, you see the centers at the top of this list, they have the most amount of players that are hitting a point per game, even when scoring is not up. When you have 23 guys who hit point per game average, you have 8 centermen, and that's just slightly above the rest of the positions. But if you look back to the previous full seasons that we had, 12 centers, 16 centers, 13 centers. So the centers are driving points. But what about goals? So this is the same type of visualization, but for goals. And this will just give you an idea that, again, the last 2 seasons was a little bit different because of the scoring imbalances and the way things worked out with COVID. But if you go back to 1920 and the previous full seasons, there's only one right winger who had, this is a 40 goal pace. It's a 0.5 goal per game average. And there was 4 left wingers, and then the rest of them are centermen. And if you go back to 18-19, the same type of thing plays out. Ovechkin, Arvidsson, they were the only 2 left wingers. You had a couple more right wingers that season, but by and large, the centers are the ones that are driving goals as well. And this is the breakdown in terms of a chart. You had 24 players last season who were averaging a 40 goal pace, which is incredible. Goal scoring was up all across the league, and a lot of that went to left wingers this particular season. And you could see that in guys like Kreider, guys like Jason Robertson took off. But typically what you see, even here, there's a lot of centers dominating this category in terms of 40 goal scorers. There are some wingers, and usually the guys, the Ovechkins and the Kaprizovs and whatnot. But by and large, the centers are still dominating this category. Now for assists, I'm not going to go over this too much. Now you can find all of these charts, all of these visualizations in the description below, and you can play around with them yourself. It might help you during your draft because you might be able to figure out which guys produce assists and goals and whatnot, and you can kind of tailor your team around what the data is telling you. But just to give you a sense, there's a lot more defensemen who get an average of 0.5 assists per game, which is what this metric is. But there's still a ton of centers, and the centers are still dominant in this category. And if you go back in time to the last full season before COVID, you still see a lot of the same phenomenon happening where there's a lot more centers than any other position averaging 0.5 assists per game. Now, again, not going to go over this too much because this is just here to illustrate the fact that there's a lot more guys who can get you assists than there are that can get you goals. And even in these categories, the centers are still more prevalent. So what are the key takeaways here? If centers are dominating all 3 of those categories, that means that there's more of them, and you can find them later in drafts. You can, typically the guys at the top, the Matthews, the McKinnons and such, McDavids, you're going to have to draft those in the first round, but you can still find guys who can get you point per game average later in drafts and sometimes on the waiver wire. What you can't find are goal scoring wingers. There's only 3.4 of them per season, right wingers, and 4.4 per season left wingers that are putting a 40 goal pace up. So what the strategy here is you try to corner the market on goal scoring wingers and centers if you can. If your first draft pick is Matthews, and then you can pair that up with a guy like Kaprizov, which probably not because he's a first round pick this year. But if you can corner the market on goal scoring wingers, you can prevent other teams in your league from challenging you on goals and usually shots and points as well. Guys who shoot the puck and score goals are also going to put up points. They're going to put up shots. So you're going to have a better command over your offensive categories, which is going to help you win more often. But what the secret sauce of this is, if you're cornering the market on goals, let's say, so on average, there's about 12.5 players, excluding this past season because scoring was up, but usually there's about 12.5 players per season hitting that pace. If you have 4 of them, it's going to be very difficult for anybody else in your league to challenge you on goals in a head-to-head matchup. And that goes for regular season, obviously, and it can put you over the top and get you into the playoffs. But when you're in the playoffs, if somebody's trying to challenge you in goals in that specific category and you've got 4 guys who are putting up a 40-goal pace, it's going to be very difficult for whoever you're playing against to compete against you in those categories, not just goals, but shots and points as well. And in terms of prioritizing goal-scoring wingers, this mainly applies when you're deciding between 2 relatively equal players. You don't want to pass up on a Matthews or a McDavid or anybody like that to specifically pick a winger. I did that one year. I picked Kucherov over McDavid, and that was the year after Kucherov put up like 130 points. So I thought I was being smart by cornering the market on goal-scoring wingers, but I passed up on McDavid, which is obviously the dumbest thing you could possibly do. And if you've seen my previous videos, I was terrible at fantasy until I started applying this strategy, and that was before I applied this strategy because I wasn't thinking I was trying to overgame the situation too much, and I wasn't really just using common sense and picking the best player available. So the takeaway here, don't just ignore the best player available and take a goal-scoring winger. But, for example, if you're choosing between, let's say, you're drafting at 7th overall, and you're choosing between Panarin and Pastrnak, you should probably go with Pastrnak because he's a goal-scoring winger, as opposed to Panarin, who's mainly an assists and power play points guy. And that's going to allow you to, again, corner the market on goals and allow, people aren't going to be able to challenge you. This is just a quick breakdown of what your team may look like, your roster construction. So this is what my team looked like last year. I had 3 of these goal-scoring wingers. Now, some of these guys are dual position eligible, like DeBrincat, and Rantanen was a center right wing. Kyle Connor was strictly a left wing, but he's worth it. Look at he had almost 0.6 goals per game average. He had 47 goals last year. DeBrincat had 41 goals. Rantanen had 37 goals. Larkin had 31. Nylander had 34. There was a lot of goal scoring in the top part of my roster. And then I've also, if you watch the second video of this series, I also had Cale Makar, who was number 1 in goals. He had 28 goals. And I had Yossi, who was number 2 in defensive goal scoring, and he had 23 goals. So nobody could challenge me on goals. And you can just take a look at this visualization. This is the team breakdown, goals per game. That's what you just saw. This is my dashboard. If you want to go and check out any of these stats, you can go here and you can find any of these things for yourself. And I'm just going to go to my own league and find the goal category just to give you a sense of how this works. That was my roster construction, and this is what ended up happening. I won 73% of my goal categories, and that was what allowed me to get into the finals. Actually, I finished 3rd, but that was goaltending related. But still, AC Delaware River won the league, and he had 64% goal coverage. And so what this tells you is if you can corner the market on goals, you are going to be far better off. And if you can do so with wingers, then nobody else is going to have the available talent to challenge you in those categories. So just a quick breakdown of some of this data. Again, you can find it all at the description below. And hopefully this gives you a better sense of how you can construct your team to maximize value to win a championship this season. And if you want to stay tuned, I'll be doing a couple more of these videos as we get closer to draft season, and we'll do a couple of different analyses, not just draft strategies. So keep an eye out for those in the future. But I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.